Record. I see Julie Burrows in here. I see we have Cher, we have Charles, Diane, Alex coming in. Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to give it just another minute before I get kicked off with my official spiel, which I know Alberto has heard before. I see you in here, Alberto. And then we'll get everything cooking. Great, great, great. Looks like folks are coming in. Wonderful. And we are recording. So let's just do this thing. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kalia Garrido. I head up marketing and events here at Great Data Minds. If you don't know us already, Great Data Minds is a collective of passionate data activists, and we do this in two different ways. The first is that we have our services arm at gdminnovationlabs.com. This is where we do our strategic planning, education, and the deployment of critical data projects. And then over on this side of the house, this is greatdataminds.com. This is our community and our content and our events engine, and this is where we have really awesome and intriguing thought leadership conversations, just like the one you're going to hear today. A little bit of housekeeping as we get kicked off. This is a webinar, so of course your cameras and microphones are off, but we encourage chat. We would love to hear from you either in the Q&A or more specifically in the actual chat. That way your fellow participants can see the conversation that you're having, so we'll get that kicked off as well. We'll also reserve a little bit of time at the end of the session for a more formal Q&A. If you want to hold your questions until then, if you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you. So we've got a lot of different options for you to be able to chat in here. Some introductions of our esteemed panelists today. We have our special guest is Brian Coker. He is an accomplished leader in the IT solutions delivery space with more than 15 years experience. He's a subject matter expert in data architecture, database design, enterprise data warehousing, and business intelligence, just to name a few. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And then, of course, my partner in crime is Mr. Mike Lampa, the one and only. He is our Chief Analytics Officer here at Great Data Minds and GDM Innovation Labs. Mike has got a career's worth of strategic and practical data and analytics experience, both as an enterprise user and as a consultant, working with some of the world's most prestigious brands. This is a guy that not only does the interviews, but he also keeps all our delivery projects running. So, Mike, as always, thank you for joining me on the other line. You're muted.
Unmute myself. Thank you, Kalia. Brian, welcome.
Thanks, Mike.
How are you today?
Great. Great. Good to see you.
Good to see you again. All right, my friends. So, information asset valuation framework. That's what we're going to be talking about that today. Help us, what does that really mean to us? Can you share a little bit to the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Talking about the information asset management valuation, I think of this as kind of a component within a bigger practice or a bigger discipline. We'll talk a little bit about this data flagship framework, which I think of as kind of this framework of frameworks and kind of containing exactly what you just talked about, the information asset valuation component of that, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. I think there's kind of three areas I'd love to talk about a little bit as on this and kind of introducing this. And first, if I can bring up a slide, I'll share. So the three different things that I would love to share here are, one, the kind of from a burning platform perspective. Like, there is a lot of talk about this particular topic, and so I'll introduce kind of the burning platform side here. And maybe first, can you see my screen? Is that coming through?
Yes, sure is.
Okay, cool. The second thing, I'll kind of talk about the framework at a very high level, just kind of its purpose and goals and things like that. And then let's look under the hood a little bit here. But from a burning platform, I'm not going to exhaust the slide, but there's no shortage of content out there. If you're looking up, information asset management and kind of that practice of valuation of your assets, there's a lot of talk about really that being kind of this next level of data management and the discipline around that. So within this, just kind of three key things that pop out to me is this this call to action from a lot of these very well-known sort of thought leader organizations. So there's the managing your data as an asset as a key factor in data management strategy. And this is really that formalized practice around evaluating value of your assets and really understanding value. And we're definitely going to get into this a little bit more as we talk about the framework. The other piece that's kind of buried in here is that notion of data culture, right? A lot of this stuff and driving value from your assets really requires data culture. It can't just generate from within kind of a bubble or deep within kind of the IT organization. Value of these assets really need to be part of the culture and part of the conversation. Thirdly, what I see here, a lot of kind of direction around, hey, empower those CDOs, give those data leaders that platform to, and also they talk about even in here kind of that reporting structure. So moving them out of IT and into more of that kind of leadership organizational structure. So, you know, those are kind of the key areas that I take from a lot of that burning platform. So let's move then from the data platform and kind of talk a little bit about the data flagship framework at a very high level. What we're talking about here is that kind of formalization of concepts and principles generating from information asset management as a general practice, right? There's a lot of information around that. I won't exhaust that, but I'm sure that there is enough familiarity around that. There's also components of like data monetization and things like that that are kind of built into this framework as well. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, really the purpose and goal of this framework is driving and enabling more discipline and rigor around data management. Kind of that, the framework kind of gives that formula or whatever. So it allows data leaders to not have to build the airplane as they go. It's really, or in flight. It's really that we are providing a framework so that can be practiced and build in that rigor and discipline into data management. And then finally, at a high level, it's as much an influencer as it is influenced by other sort of sister disciplines, such as data cataloging and metadata management, data governance, business architecture, enterprise, all of those things with that sort of common and shared goal around data centricity, data quality, and driving from value of those assets. Mm-hmm. So at a high level.
You know, Brian, I love where you're going with this. You know, because there's a lot of talk, a lot of people are starting to get on the bandwagon, or at least based on the chatter that you see out in the industry around considering data as a product and treating it as a product with a life cycle. I love how you're elevating that. It's not only a data product, but it actually is a value generator. And when that starts to happen, it becomes an asset. And we love that because we really believe in data products, you know, with the data product life cycle. We also believe, you know, using techniques like behavior-driven design, we really drive out and focus in around what's the value that the analytic insight is going to generate. What's it going to influence, right? Which ties into this valuation framework. I love it. And your other point around, we need to enable these CDOs because, you know, look at some of those stats. I mean, 30% of the CDOs have any kind of a formal relationship. 75% of the organizations have a CDO, but interestingly enough, they're set up for failure, which is reiterated by other Gartner research that says, you know, the average tenure of a CDO is about 18 months, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I love the cultural aspect, which is probably the most difficult thing to evolve, is that cultural transformation to become more of a analytic driven organization. So
yeah, couldn't agree with you
love where
more.
you're going with this. Yep.
Cool. And then just I'm going to move kind of to the next slide here because I want to unpack and level set a few concepts here before diving into the actual framework here. And really the concepts are the information asset. So I know that first question is, I don't know if it's a question, but I think that there's a lot of assumption that everybody knows what an asset is. I think in the data space in particular, kind of need to think about this a little bit more. But the information is an asset. It's understood when you have that understand the value from the perspective of those who are demanding it or consuming it, as well as that understanding of what it takes to actually produce that thing. And once you have kind of both of those sides, that sort of supply and demand view and an understanding of value, that's when you can look at this thing as an asset and not really understand it as an asset and not just use that term to coin what the data is. The other piece here is the investments. We're gonna these come out in the framework as we talk about this. So I just want to make sure that we're all like clear when we're using these terms. So investments is that commitment of resources channeled into an existing asset or the productization of a new asset, or it's really the optimization of whatever it takes to get that product, that asset into the hands of the consumers or those who are demanding it. And finally, there's the value. This is kind of this is the key piece, right? So it's that quantifiable measure. And I think that's what we're all looking for, is that sort of quantifiable aspect of the asset that says, this is a value. This is the thing that we're going to use to measure, are we adding value or not? And also it is that sort of common lexicon between anybody that's looking at this asset, whether it's IT, whether it's data, whether it's business. We all kind of understand value, right? And should all have kind of a say in what that is. And that speaks to the data culture, that speaks to all of that stuff that comes together here. So just wanted to unpack those things under the hood before we move to the next section here.
So, a couple things that are jumping out at me here. I love the demand-driven model, right? Because so many times we go into organizations and they've been spending years and millions of dollars building it, and they will come, right? Building data.
Yeah, exactly.
But nobody's using it because we didn't engage to understand what's the value that's going to get generated out of this investment. So I absolutely love to see that.
Yeah.
The other thing, just an observation I have, is many times when I'm trying to help an organization put a quantifiably measurable value against the outcomes that an analytic is going to produce, which is enabled by data, of course, I get CFOs that say, you can't do that. You can't put a value on analytic. And my response back to that is, well, if you say you can't, you're not going to do it, right?
Yeah.
But there is a way of making this happen. Yes, sometimes it's an influencing factor to help move the needle of some key performance measure. In other cases, it has direct tangible contribution to value. So appreciate the thought process you're unveiling to us today.
Yeah. I think you also kind of hit on something there too, is that investment is I think a big pivot from kind of traditionally the way of thinking. You mentioned that kind of build as they come. That's sort of that, like, I'd say upside down investment, which is like, let's throw dollars at something, get a platform in place. And then once we hit sort of that critical mass and move forward on this, then we can start to see returns over time. I think the big part of this framework is kind of flipping that, turning that upside or right side up, really, and saying, let's target some outcome that we want to hit. Let's understand the value behind the assets that we're touching in this investment, and that becomes part of the conversation, very negotiable. And then actually you drive your investment from understanding a value to begin with, and then you can monitor and track that after. And we'll kind of see that as we go through more of the framework as well.
Mm-hmm. So talk to me a little about the identity and the influence and the measure success components there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is kind of mapping where this all kind of started from me, and kind of the genesis of the framework. And Callie, I mentioned that I have some tenure in this space. It's actually probably almost closer to 25 years that I've been in the data space, and so the experience that I've had really can be summed up in like 3 key sort of observations, being in that place of a data leader or an architect, any of those roles. And it really came down to 3 main challenges that I wanted to address somehow. And I think this framework really does that. So the identity piece is really a struggle, I think, for it has been a struggle for a lot of those data teams, being very buried in IT, and are we providing reports? Are we a report generator? How connected are we with the business? So that identity piece is floating, and it's very susceptible and sensitive to industry changes, right? We've seen that pendulum go from centralized to distributed or federated or whatever the case may be, and this pendulum always seems to shift for various reasons. The influence piece is kind of tied to the identity, but is that piece of the empowerment, that we talked about, and that piece is really a lot of data teams are, okay, we need to manage costs because IT says so, or we need to do those, or we need to provide some solution for a business, but not being very connected to the outcomes and what that drives. So that influence piece is not really baked into there, and that's another piece that we address in the framework. And then the success measures, like how do you know those investments are actually generating any sort of returns, and so a way to kind of track that over time can be done through this valuation. And so as I kind of mapped what I felt were really big challenges in the space, I kind of mapped them to these elements to understand that like asset and managing as an asset sort of provides that identity. We have something that we're managing, and we have something of value that we're managing. The investments, we're going to partner on very specific investments that are going to drive outcomes, and collectively, as part of our culture, as part of a collective, we're going to drive that growth. We're all part of that journey. And then the measures of success, we use value to measure success of the products that we're creating, measure the success as an organization as a whole, and that collective strategy. All of those things can be really tracked and measured through value. So that was kind of the vision that I had there.
Genesis, I love that. One of the things you touched on within the topic of identity, especially in this age of software specialization that's happening, with an eye towards self-service enablement, it really causes some identity crisis within the traditional IT domain-driven data and analytics programs. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, that's part of the pendulum, right? There's definitely a value proposition to be made to put things more in the hands of those who need to consume it, and there's a lot of trends pointing to that. Data mesh, a lot of these things, right? But pushing it so far out there, you kind of lose that sort of governance and that quality side of things potentially, and reuse. And so that's the balance that's kind of critical there, right?
On identity again, can we go back to that? It feels like the question is is the data and analytics team or the office of the CDO properly positioned to, to enable some kind of an alignment?
Yeah, exactly. And that I love that question. And I think that's absolutely true. I think in most organizations, I mean, you kind of have to ask yourself, if you're part of a data organization, do you have that sort of platform or kind of podium? I don't know how you want to look at it, but and it goes also back to that influence piece, right? Like, are you able to have those conversations, and do you have that sort of common language to talk with the business and sort of like get that shared goal and identity? Are you positioned to do that, or really are you positioned to just kind of be in that sort of back office, take orders and produce the reports or produce access to data or something very almost removed from what it actually gets used for and how it gets applied to the business? So that's, I absolutely agree with you there.
Love that. So do you have some underlying primary influencers that helped you as the underpinning of the asset valuation framework?
Yeah, I think this also sort of the genesis of the framework also kind of came together. Really, for me, it was kind of reading a couple different books that I got a lot out of. And I think, if you're kind of in that space of understanding data monetization or asset management in general, the Infonomics by Doug Laney is probably a kind of mainstay here and a big part of that. There's things that popped out to me as really thinking of a big part of really understanding and being able to manage your data as an asset is understanding the ecosystem behind it and what creates it, and really thinking of it in terms of a supply chain, not just the sort of like data pool or data swamp or whatever you want to call it, but really thinking about that end-to-end process of building the products. So that was a big piece. And then just sort of like the asset and kind of balancing and accounting behind these things, the economics, that was also a big piece of, to me, that jumped out, is really understanding then the economics from not only the supply side, but also the demand side, and starting to really use those to frame up the value component. So yeah, these things really came out of that. Another, and it was probably timing of these two things more than anything, but there's another book that jumped out to me, and it's called Data-Centric Revolution by Dave McComb. And these books, for all intents and purposes, have very different purposes and points. But I think the thing that really jumped out here to me was that this sort of power of abstraction of your assets. I don't know that it was actually a message in the book per se, but I think that a lot of the tools and principles that he applied there, at least I took away from that, was this power of abstraction and that being done through the data ontology. I think he says most organizations, big organizations, have no more than 20 to 25, maybe 50 entities or data concepts within their ontology. I think the power of this abstraction in this framework really helps to kind of, just like you would in a product space, you're going to talk about products and sort of market share and things like that at that abstraction level. I think you need that just as much in this space as you do any sort of like product and marketing side of things. So that's kind of the piece that I took of this, and I kind of married those concepts together. And I don't know that it's necessarily obvious just looking at the framework itself, but certainly a practice I try to apply in sort of framing this up.
Well, two incredible bodies of knowledge there.
Yeah.
So okay, so you set the pick around the burning platform. We need to do things differently to generate value as an industry. You help us understand the genesis of the framework. What'd you say we dig in and actually take a peek at the framework?
I love that idea. Yes. So next, so I think I really tried to come up with this sort of like elevator pitch, if you will, and really sort of like frame up the objective of this. And I think this kind of, this really says it. And at the beginning, you know, I think you can look at this and sort of tie it back to those burning platform things, but really at the beginning is like empowering data leaders and innovators to cultivate that data-centric organization, data culture, that drives business growth through smart information asset investments. That's kind of the driving force. And then taking that, and then where the success measures of those investments are both projected, so you use them to plan investments, and monitored through data-driven practice of information asset valuation. So you use those values to not only drive what you're going to invest in, because we can see that this is going to be an area or a space that is potentially adding more value, and so has at least a voice that needs to be heard. So using value to kind of drive those investments, as well as understand that the investments you're making are the right ones. And also the framework does set itself up for that continuous monitoring. So I think that's you know, one thing, as you know, if you're project driven or things like that, you just want to see, hey, does this investment that we're making, did it achieve what we targeted? It's either yes or no, and there you have it, done. But I think that the framework here and really managing as an asset is that you're seeing that ongoing value lift and growth over time, and you are managing it, and you're building that into your culture of, you know, reviewing additional investments that you want to make, and then also sharing that the investments you've made, we haven't lost sight of those. We're still seeing value there, or we're seeing, you know, value wane. How can we revisit those and maybe, you know, make some adjustments, or whatever the case may be.
So are there some adoption challenges around this? You know,
Absolutely.
adopting the framework mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the biggest challenges, and I think you said earlier, one of those is that culture shift. Like this does require, you know, a culture shift. And so I think, you know, to really get this in place, you need not just support from leadership, but I think the big thing is actually starting those conversations and sort of pivoting from maybe an organization that at one point or currently is sort of buried in IT, to moving out and actually having a place at the table to drive strategy, to have a say in strategy, and also be able to have those conversations with the business consumers, you know, the you know, demand side of the equation, and bring all of that together. And so it is a culture shift. It will require some very different mindset, and that's, you know, let's not candy coat that at all.
Right.
So I think that is a really a big shift and a challenge here. Another one is this sort of leaning into valuations. And I think there's a couple parts of this, but I think the valuations piece is kind of moving away from that there's a strict formula across the board here. I think really kind of adopting and adapting to this valuation process as almost a negotiation. And I think if you kind of look at it, how you would sort of market or push a product, you know, in a kind of that tangible asset side of things, you're going to do like focus groups. You're going to have those kind of conversations that really get a sense of what this is and how this is going to be received, and really what the value is. And so letting that demand side or supply side really have a say and probably tell you what it is from a value perspective, and then bring that together. You know, so it's really partnering that way. So that's a big thing.
Can I pop in with a question? Oh, Sorry. Yeah, we had a question come through, and I just wanted to address. I don't think that the webinar chat is working properly, so I would welcome everybody to use the Q&A. And we do have a question that came in for you here, Brian. Somebody is asking, does this break down for companies with service-oriented business models, like not SaaS models? It says the framework seems somewhat predicated on product-based businesses.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is looking at those kind of, if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's kind of like almost sort of that data exchange, or sort of like more real time. It's not necessarily data analytics. I don't know. I guess I need to kind of maybe understand that. I'm making some assumptions of what the question means. Yeah. But I think it absolutely is relevant there as well, because it's still that there is a supply and a demand for the data or the asset. And so I think it is, in that case, looking at those services, or I don't know if we're talking about it in this way, but those APIs or those connectors as assets, and then who's demanding those. And so, yeah, I think it's absolutely set up to address that as well.
Yeah, I would offer, it might be because we're talking such manufacturing oriented terminology here around, product life cycle and all that kind of thing. But any company that is selling some kind of good and service into an industry can take advantage of this and figure out a way to put a value generation framework in place for why we're doing analytics. Whether I'm trying to help marketing be more effective in its spend, or sales be more effective in their sales cycles, or product engineering, learning about things that they have to fix with their hard goods or services, all the way out to, from a loan portfolio manager, all these kinds of things. How can I do better with across the business domains using analytics to inform me?
Yeah, and there, I might be interpreting the question another way as well, but I think one way that at least I'm understanding that question too is thinking of that final data as a product, and are we talking about sort of that external, like we're going to sell this or we're going to monetize this asset externally? Mm-hmm. And yes, that actually plays in here as well, but I think most of our examples and most of our chatter here today is focused on that more that internal sort of market from a supply and demand perspective. So we're looking at, as a data organization, we have this data supply chain that is producing products that are consumed within the organization. And I think that's sort of like a missing link that at least that's been a real challenge that I've seen in the past, is being able to really have that understanding and that sort of market-driven supply and demand, and make it quantifiable, make it really understood, and make decisions that are going to be measurable. And so, yeah, I think most of our conversation is focusing on that sort of internal part of this, but absolutely the framework works in all aspects there. And great. We can jump into the next slide here, because I think this will give a little bit more perspective on the framework itself. Unless, Mike, was there something you wanted to talk about here too, or? No,
you anticipated what I was going to say. Hey, let's take a look at the framework.
All right.
We got the objective.
Right. Jumping in. Okay. So yeah, we talked about the objective of this, and there's a lot here. I totally understand there's a lot here, but I do want to kind of put side by side the data flagship framework, like I mentioned, sort of a framework of frameworks. And by that, I mean a framework around sort of strategic alignment, the framework that we're talking about more today around the information asset valuation. There's kind of framework, and Mike, I know this is an area that's near and dear to you, is that asset investment delivery side of things. So this plugs into that lean agile delivery side of things. And then there's a framework around that monitoring, like how are we going to set this up so we continue to monitor the investments and the performance on not only the investments, but the assets that are being invested in, right? And then under the hood, or under that, there is this sort of data-centric data culture side of and framework around that. There needs to be sort of a discipline around, what you're bringing to the table, what you're discussing, how often you're reviewing, and things like that. So that's kind of baked in there as well. We're not going to get into those. We're really going to take this time and focus in on that information asset valuation framework piece. So here, right off the bat, you can look at this and see we talk about supply side, we talk about demand side. And when we talk about this valuation, we're talking about kind of 3 tiers of this. It's really the measure itself, and then there's the model, and then the ledger, or that piece that's sort of like in context of an asset. What are all the sort of valuation components? And they're going to be in different contexts. So the measure itself is the thing that you're going to measure, whether it's, some examples here, a revenue-based, or whether it's kind of a rate-based kind of percentage and things like that. These sort of additive values that you're going to use to not only assess that asset's value, but you're going to then project or tie it to something that even if it's strategic, right? We want to increase revenue by XYZ, amount. So we're going to look at these measures as sort of our the things that we're going to track to get us there. The model is that sort of context, and maybe you can think of it more at that macro level of, hey, this is our set of measures that are going to get us to that that revenue increase, and then we're going to see within that each of these kind of micro level measures, or what specifically value increase we expect to produce there. So it's kind of a taxonomy here, and that ledger then is specifically in context of an asset, whether it's kind of, I talked earlier about that abstraction level, or it's at a very specific data product level. And we can definitely, get into that as well. But then, yeah, getting back to some of the terms and elements that we've already unpacked, is that this is we're talking about the sort of narrative and formulation of how we achieve getting to that value, and then setting what we want to get to, and then applying that through investments. These are the things that we're going to start to invest in. And these begin to turn into not only targeted values, but actual business cases that we could turn into then very specific user stories and start to deliver on these. So there's a formula here, absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm loving that you mentioned earlier, it's not really a boilerplate model. It's more, it's an art to figure
absolutely.
out that value generation equations, but it's doable. There's a framework there, right?
It's doable, especially, and we'll always come back to this, that culture side of this has to be there, right? Because I can't imagine there's a successful product out there, and I know I'm going back to that sort of like product analogy. I can't imagine that there's a successful product out there that is seeing the sales, seeing the margins, and successfully being sold in the market without having influence on what's driving the price around it or the value around that. Like, focus groups have been done. We're looking at the sales or whatever to really understand we get better sales if we lower the price, and we can sell more volume, and that actually, and so that's kind of a similar mindset that happens here when you talk about the different kind of economics behind the asset, and start to play with those to increase value, increase margin, kind of having that same mindset here. And so this part of the platform is really about setting that up, and becomes that conversation place. So at that value measure, at that kind of top point, really this is like, starting with, in the sense of, what business measures are we really, do we care about, or are we really kind of emphasizing here? And then understanding the data that's connected to those as a at least part of the story of how we increase that. Business is going to do its thing, but the data that they're using to do their thing has a value, and that's what we need to kind of talk about. And let's come up with something. And this is the idea here is that it's not set in stone. Once you come up with a value, that's it, and you can't move. The idea is, all right, let's assess. Maybe there's a different way to look at this, a different measure, or maybe a different way to calculate this that is more connected to the actual business value. So this framework really kind of forces you to have those conversations too. Yeah. So.
And I love, so what really caught my eye when you and I first connected, Brian, or captured my imagination around this is how nicely this plugs into a lean, agile product delivery mindset. At Great Data Minds, we're constantly trying to help organizations evolve towards this lean, agile product delivery, not project, right? Yeah. And it starts with that strategic alignment where you lay out your analytic portfolio as a canvas. This is what we're going to do over the next 12 to 18 months. And then from there, you start to define product releases. What key analytic capabilities are we going to do across the business domains? And as part of that, you're taking objectives and key results from the strategic initiatives of the enterprise, and you're mapping them to the analytic portfolio. And then when you start to build out these product release definitions, you're identifying, here's the lift that we're looking to do. Here's the needle we're looking to move through this analytic. And then using behavior-driven design techniques, we really drill in and say, okay, what's going to be the quantifiable thing that we're measuring as an outcome that's going to be influenced by the analytic, along with any kind of leading indicators, Yeah. So if I would, let's say marketing wants to build a much more effective campaign management discipline to improve their spend, right? So we got to get this customer 360 model figured out. We got to understand all the digital exhaust. And then we got to do some segmentation of those customers, see if we can identify the right campaign targets. And the whole goal here is I want to get my take rate up from 3% to 10%. Just making some numbers up. What does that mean to you, sales? If I'm giving you an increase of marketing qualified leads for you to close, what does that result in as far as a revenue lift? And does that meet your goal? Yeah. And all these things get objectively documented during behavior-driven design, and then they have to be implemented as a set of execution telemetry once the analytic and the data products are moved into production and are consumed. So I just love how this framework can plug into that.
Yeah, I was just thinking plug and play. Yep, absolutely. No, that's good. I think, very, very much from that planning side of things and coming up with the value that you're going to push into those product development aspects, and then taking that back out and as part of the framework, continuously monitoring that, right? That absolutely. That, just the value of being able to track the success of that investment, over a longer period of time, and see that it's waning, or we need to kind of bump it up, and what are you going to do about that? And right. Really having the business, those who are demanding that at the table, and seeing that, hey, this is we're seeing the lift that we expected, or we're not. There's something that's not quite there. What are we going to do about it? And really kind of allowing your business partnership in that data-driven culture side of things to really have a say, and maybe at the end of the day, really own, kind of an ownership of setting kind of the direction of where things need to go, what new investments, what revisions to the existing investment need to be made. And I know we're talking at very, very high level here, but I think anybody in the space can start to apply this and use their imagination. Where this can really start to help out.
Yeah. Hey, we got a question in from Alex.
Yeah.
Abreu, if I pronounced that properly. Alex is interested on our insight on any best practices for defining value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I do think this, just like you said, this is an art. And I think that there are a few things and value. You have to kind of like take it on both the supply, there's kind of different points of view from whether you're talking about from the supply side or the demand side. I think on the supply side, there's components of this looking at, some of the easy ones might be creating sort of a total cost of ownership and understanding, in context of maybe your warehouse implementation or some legacy implementation, even looking at those separate and then understanding that sort of supply side valuation. Could be things like, hey, we understand total cost of ownership. When we look at this asset, do we want to use sort of like an even distribution across all the assets, or does volume of certain assets, on this platform have a say in kind of value? It'll be things like that. Those are the things that like you may not even know like right off the bat, but those are the things that like, hey, I was thinking about this, the valuation that we're talking about here. We forgot to really consider, the manual side, or the personnel, or the operational side of this, or the subscription. There's a lot of things that could maybe not be factored, but things that you'll sort of want to mature and bake into those valuations. Mm-hmm. But that's part of this whole process. You add those things in, and then you reevaluate. Is that algorithm that we were using to set this value, does it really represent the value as we think about it? If not, change it. And then same with on the demand side. I think the difference here is you have maybe some of these key drivers around value stream indicator, performance indicators, KPIs, whatever sort of business measurement side of things that you use. I don't know, OKRs, any of these type of things that might sort of represent the key sort of strategic, business outcome space that you want to create. So those can be the things that you start with. And then as you start to drive into what measures, how you're going to measure value, whether you're going to take a revenue-based look at this, or whether you're going to take there's things that we can bake into this or too around like risk, around some of these other sort of equality could be things as well. Some things that are not necessarily financially or fiscally driven, but things that sort of represent a value or a risk to value or things like that. So these kind of measures can also be included in there. And then you understand sort of the context that you're driving for, what sort of strategic initiative or whatnot. And then you set that, and that's also then becomes the conversation between the data team and the business side of really understanding, okay, do we want to talk about the value of customer asset in terms of per customer revenue? Are we going to look at volume to understand how many customers we have here and how does that relate to volume? So there's a lot of things that can be done here. And I know you can go very complicated, or you can really kind of oversimplify for the sake of let's see how this really takes. Let's see if this really gives us something.
Yeah.
So
and from using a set of techniques, I mentioned behavior-driven design earlier. We did a bit of an adaptation of behavior-driven development that's used in the software industry as a vehicle for driving out minimum viable product or product increment specifications, where you understand the analytic stakeholder, you understand the business hypothesis that we're looking to prove or disprove. And this could be with visualization oriented actionable insights, or this could be with predictive models, right? Yeah. I have a hypothesis. I want to be able to prove that hypothesis. And when I prove it, I want to have a set of objective measures and, submit it, subject to being specific, measurable, achievable, relevant to the use case and time-based, right? And then mark that objective and say, this is what we're going to measure, and here's our expected lift. So that becomes my target. And then when we implement the analytic, we're tracking from the point of implementation, are we moving the needle on that KPI that we said we wanted to get a target lift, and are we moving it in the right way?
Absolutely. And I kind of wrap up here by specifically saying it was very intentional not to have a lot of these prepackaged or predefined algorithms here, because I think we're talking about this being this framework of frameworks. So it is things that there's an opportunity now to kind of plug in that sort of design thinking or design driven, you just said it totally right. Using those kind of frameworks to then really cultivate those conversations of how you're going to set value. And so this is really sort of like a kind of foundation, and then building out how, the different techniques that you're going to use to drive those values and those conversations could be a number of different things. And I like that would plug in right into that, right?
Yeah, and I totally agree that there's no like list of libraries, for evaluation. I do believe that over time, as you keep exercising this memory muscle, you're going to start to see patterns, valuation patterns evolve.
Absolutely.
Because but it's going to be use case by use case, and when you get into different analytic use cases, you might find that you got a new pattern.
Yep, exactly.
So you have to be open to that continuous discovery. Yep.
Definitely. And since the supply side has such an impact here, every company has its own sort of implementation or its own kind of architecture sort of approach to this that has a factor in that too. So it has to be open. Yeah.
All right. Well, this again, I love this. I love the whole mind share that you shared with us today, Brian. I think it is an incredibly important thing for people to start adopting as part of lifting up the data and analytics space to be first-class citizens within organizations. Yeah,
absolutely. Awesome.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much for sharing all this knowledge with us, Brian. And thank you everybody for who's on the line. If anybody wants more information about this or to see how this can apply at their company, they can reach out to us at info@greatdataminds.com. I'm also going to send a follow-up email tomorrow with a survey that you can let us know how we did at this event. We wish everybody a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.